of the World House Project and the Dais, along with all our fantastic partners, colleagues, and friends from all our network. So I thank you wholeheartedly on behalf of all the organizers for joining in. This is a very exciting day also because we have completed the 1 year anniversary of the World House project, I believe. So so before we go into further details of what the summit holds, we will be hearing from the founding director of the World House project, whose vision has led us to this day, Dr. Clayborne Carson. So, Dr. Carson, an introduction from you before we begin, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you for organizing this meeting. It's really encouraging to see all the faces of. I think really encouraging that most of them are young. Some of them don't have gray hair like I have, and I always want to think that there's a new generation coming on to continue the struggle for justice and human rights into the future. So I think my message is fairly direct, and that is nonviolence is essential, but not sufficient. And what I mean by that is that I hope that on this day, we recall that the reason why we learn about nonviolence and practice nonviolence is that we've seen that it can change the world for the better. And I say that because I think it's very important to point out that the World House Project, by the way, is an idea that Martin Luther King developed. And he was looking into the future and saying that we all live in this world and we have to learn to live peacefully in a more just world. But he also said we have to build that world, that all of us are obligated because we live in it to make it a better place. And so I use that metaphor to remind us that nonviolence is not a solitary activity. Yes, you can practice nonviolence without interacting with other people. And in fact, that's probably the best way of staying nonviolent is just don't do anything in the world. But as I said, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the idea of the World House Project and even the working group that you're a part of is to build networks. I've seen in my own life that coming together with other people with the same kinds of beliefs can be an effective way of changing the world. I've seen it in my lifetime, certainly in the American civil rights struggle. It was not simply that people went through nonviolence training and learned many of the lessons from Gandhi, but that they joined together in a struggle. And actually, my first book was about that struggle. It was led by people we call now freedom riders, who were willing to confront the evils of Southern segregation and eventually overcome the Jim Crow system in the South and get legislation passed that has changed American society. Similarly, in my lifetime, I've seen the anti-apartheid movement. Similarly, networking people around the world to, for the first time probably in human history, of changing a nuclear-powered nation, forcing it to change its racial policies and get rid of the apartheid system. That was a tremendous accomplishment in both cases, requiring decades of work. So I hope that particularly the young people who have decades left to do their work will take this lesson and understand that there's not a moment to lose. If you are not now connected with other people who are also committed to nonviolence, you should be. a solitary, nonviolent person is not very effective in the struggle against injustice. So I hope that the network that Keshav, you've been able to build already, um, it's a slow process. It involves getting to know people, getting to trust people, and I think that you've made a great start. And so I hope that the lesson that comes out of this gathering is that it is a long struggle. When Martin Luther King said, "Where do we go from here?" I think he understood that he was talking about decades of work that would be necessary to bring about the world house he envisioned. So, so I think that you're at the beginning of that. I want to give you every encouragement I can. I'm willing to get up early in the morning in order to get this off to, I hope, a good start. So congratulations, and look forward to seeing more of these sessions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carson, for your uplifting words. Again, like it means a lot to us that you are here with us today and you've given these opening remarks. We will be hearing from Dr. Carson at length in some more time as well. So please hold your questions for Dr. Carson for that session. I want to take everyone through a little bit about what we are doing at the Turning Point Summit. And as Dr. Carson just talked about, where do we go from here? Dr. King's important question. The Turning Point Summit is the origins of the summit itself, and the name itself is coming from that question. It's a question, and the passage in Dr. King's book where he talks about the World House Project. And what he talks about is the need for a turning point from his times, but the inspiration that we took was with the current context of the global challenges. We need a turning point in our lives, in our communities, and in the world for a better future for all. So that is why this meeting has been organized, and we have been this youth working group within the World House Project is again, as Dr. Carson mentioned, dedicated to bringing youth voices out, young people's leadership in this front out. And a lot of our summits work already, which has been going on for the last couple of months, has been heavily driven by young people. But that does not mean that it's only young people who are responsible for today's day. We also have our advisor, Dr. Johnny Mack, who has been instrumental in this entire process. All our other speakers who will be speaking today. So without further ado, I also just want to highlight a couple of points that this summit today that we are celebrating the International Day of Nonviolence and Mahatma Gandhi's birthday. This is not just a one-day process, or as we have talked about, a 6-day summit. It is a starting point of a movement which intends to, from now on, keep young people and all our stakeholders together, engaged, and the entire premise and the structure of the summit is dedicated to that. So the first 2 days of the summit, which is today and tomorrow, are dedicated to the Youth Assembly on Nonviolence, which will emerge tomorrow with a youth-led declaration on nonviolence, which is again already in shape, and tomorrow it will be presented by our inspiring young speakers. So tomorrow again, I request all of you to please reconvene. Today we will be hearing from Dr. Lester Kurtz and Dr. Johnny Mack in a session moderated by Mike Selby, where we talk about the lessons we have learned from Gandhiji and Dr. King, who to me started their activism in their youth days, in their days of being young. We often see their pictures as those of older gentlemen, but I'm sure that they will also want the younger pictures to be sort of used to refer to them, not just their older pictures. So they were also quite young when they started out in their activism days. So that's our first session when we today. Thereafter, we have an inspiring conversation again with Dr. Carson, where again we will be hearing more from him. Uh, After that, the final session, we have two more sessions today, which is one of them is an inspiring youth-led panel. We have astounding and inspiring four speakers from four different parts of the world who will be talking about their journeys, their perspectives in nonviolent action. And again, it's a super inspiring session. And finally, we will be looking at going inside ourselves and talking about what is the one thing that we will do from this summit towards nonviolence and peace, towards shaping a nonviolent world. We had initially emailed everyone about that session as well, so we will be having an interactive discussion. So that's day 1 and 2 of the assembly. Day 3 of the Turning Point Summit and day 4 will be dedicated to a workshop on nonviolence and human rights and social change, led by Dr. Johnny Mack. Again, which the idea is to build a foundation, a common context for learning what nonviolence is and how we can manifest it in our respective lives, and to re-look at nonviolence other than simply the traditional understanding that many people have of a passive way of acting. So that's going to be a very critical session, and we will be closing the summit with 2 days of a youth co-creation session, where young people have been working together already from the summit to create a youth-led strategy for young people to engage on non-violence. So that will be on the 6th and 7th of October. And the whole idea is from this foundational declaration that will come out tomorrow, to looking and connecting it with the actions that can follow in. And the entire conclusions of this is what the youth working group will also be working with round the year. And the conclusions is something that we will be reconvening with in the coming days over several things. So it's not just, again, as I had mentioned, today or these 6 days, but the real, after the trailer of this movie, the real deal, the real journey starts, I think, once the summit concludes. So without now taking any more speaker time, I will be now inviting for our first session our moderator Mike Selby, and he will do a great job introducing himself. So I did not want to take that opportunity to introduce him. Mike, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Keshav. Good morning or good evening or good afternoon, everybody, wherever you're from. My name is Mike Selby. I'm in the Rocky Mountains of British Columbia in Canada, and it's a bit earlier than it is here for Dr. Carson. So let's get started. Myself, I'm a civil rights journalist, librarian. I share my office with a bunch of different people, so I have puppets and books and everything behind me, and an author of civil rights textbooks. And welcome, everybody. And I just want to say that nonviolence, as I understand it, it's the most important act in human history. So you guys are hitting it at the right age and right time. And we have 2 keynote speakers, which I will introduce. The first is Dr. Lester Kurtz. He's the editor of the Encyclopedia of Violence, Peace, and Conflict, and dozens of other books he's contributed to. He's currently working on a book on Gandhi's Paradox, 2 edited volumes on women, war, and violence, another of the Paradox of Repression, and a project called Peaceful Warriors. Dr. Kurtz has lectured in Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America, and served as chair of the Peace Studies Association and the Peace, War, and Social Conflict section of the American Sociological Association, which recently awarded him its Robin Williams Distinguished Career Award. Our other keynote speaker is Dr. Johnny Mack. He's the Associate Director of the World House Project at Stanford University, Martin Luther King Jr. Institute. He's the former director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change and the Nelson Mandela Family Foundation president. He studies and writes on social movements, social change, and human development. He holds a doctorate from Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. He has traveled extensively throughout the Americas, Africa, Middle East, Europe, and Asia, working in peace, conflict, and community development and comprehensive community planning. Probably the hardest working man in North America today. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will get to them. And I promise, and I will turn the floor over to Dr. Mack.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for your introduction and your participation. And I want to also thank my co-presenter and colleague Lester Kurtz, a longtime friend. So it's just a pleasure to be with you, Les, and for us to have this conversation about two people that we have studied and worked on for quite some time. And Lester, Mike, I know you turned it over to me, but I hope this can be a conversation, between Lester and myself, and even some of the participants. Mike, if you'll manage that process and however you choose to, but I think engaging a conversation on this important subject might be the best way to really bring in the youth and others on our call. My work principally has been Martin Luther King Jr. and his logic, as I like to call it, of nonviolent social change. And as was mentioned earlier, this idea of nonviolence is so more is much broader and vast than meets the eye. And I think both Gandhi and King understood nonviolence in ways that we have not fully explored, particularly King, following Gandhi and learning so much from Gandhi. And I think both King and Gandhi would expect that we today would do what King did. King learned from Gandhi, and he re-articulated it and expanded the idea of nonviolence, making it practical and relevant to his time and the specific circumstances that he and his colleagues, his fellow sojourners in the struggle for civil and human rights in the mid-20th century movement of African Americans did. So I think that's a wonderful way, Les, to really begin the conversation about what nonviolence is and how King and Gandhi understood them.
Oh, thanks. It's a real honor to be here, and nice to meet all of you. I think we have like 5 or 10 minutes to tell you everything I know about Gandhi, which usually takes me about 10 years. But actually, I thought following up on what people have been saying, I thought it might be good to start with a story. You may know Gandhi went off from, he grew up in India, British India, went off to England to study the law, and when he came back, he got a job as a lawyer. And so here he's a young man, fresh back from law school. He goes to court and he stands up to speak, and he's like terrified, and he's frozen and he can't speak. And he essentially fails as a lawyer, which I think is a good lesson for all of us who are not gifted with eloquence, like people like Johnny Mack and Clayborne Carson, who just kind of stumble around when we're trying to speak. That was Gandhi, right? That was the young Gandhi. So if you don't feel eloquent, why, take heart. I wanted to share a couple of things with you, and I'll talk a little fast, but if I'm going too fast, I'm not going to show you all my slides. I'll be glad to share them with you later. But I wanted to share a couple of things with you. First of all, this photograph, which was taken at a conference we organized at the University of Texas years ago, that sort of shows you the lineage and the progression. And the way I like to think about it is we have a picture of Dr. King in his office with Gandhi on the wall, picture of Gandhi on the wall. So it goes from Gandhi to King. And then we have Arun Gandhi and Bernice King holding the picture. And then it comes out to us, right? I think if we follow the progression out, so we're now that the baton has passed to us. I have like two basic things about Gandhi that I'll try to share, and then I want to at some point in the conversation I'd like to share with you part of a rap song, which I thought would be great for this audience. I taught a course on Gandhi years ago at the University of Texas, and I said, I'm flexible for the final paper. I'm flexible. Let me know what you want to do. And so one of the students came up to me and said, can I write a rap song? I said, well, okay, as long as it's annotated and cites most of the readings of the course. And he did it. He actually wrote this song that summarizes most of the points in the entire semester's course. So I thought I'd play a little bit of it for you later on. But let me make sort of two points I would like to have take away about Gandhi's message. The first one is that it's what Gandhi did that was really revolutionary, I think. Galtung says Gandhi is to conflict what Einstein and Newton were to physics. He gave us a whole new paradigm for thinking about conflict. And there are sort of two ideas or moral ethical teachings that run through all of the faith traditions and ethical teachings. The warrior and the pacifist. What are we to do when we face evil, injustice? The warrior says we have to stand up and fight, and the pacifist says we're not allowed to harm. And what Gandhi did was he put those two contradictory ideas together in the nonviolent activist, the satyagrahi, who stands up and fights without harming, right? And so nonviolent struggle is still seen as kind of a sacred duty, and Gandhi tried to address the dilemmas of both of these. So on September 11th in 1906, he launches his nonviolent resistance in South Africa. And the other sort of big point I wanted to make is that I see him sort of following three steps: listen, analyze, and mobilize, right? So the first thing to do is to listen. And I like Thich Nhat Hanh's idea of deep listening. What are the grievances? And not just the talking heads on television, but the people around the world. We have techniques for doing this now, a lot of sophisticated techniques that we didn't have at Gandhi's time. Surveys, focus groups, interviews, narrative analysis. We need to begin unpacking the multiple sources of information about how people are suffering around the world. And also now non-human inhabitants, the creatures that we share the world with and the world itself. So that's listening. Second step is analyzing. I find it really helpful to turn to Galtung's triangle. All of what Galtung has done is basically bring Gandhi into the social sciences, right? And most of what Galtung brings to us, I think, is actually inspired by and guided by Gandhi. So Galtung says we have different kinds of violence: direct violence, what we usually think of as violence, war, sexual assaults, physical assaults, so on. But underneath the surface are structural violence and cultural violence. Structural violence is the harm that's done by the way we organize society. My idea is especially malnutrition. Child malnutrition, I think, is the best example. Millions and millions of children dying of malnutrition and related causes every year. Cultural violence, all the cultural themes that reinforce that. And then I added a fourth kind of violence, eco-violence, to Galtung's 1990 article, because now we see the importance of the damage that we've done to the environment. If we flip Galtung's triangle, and this is something I've actually worked on with Johnny Mack, what I like to call the nonviolence diamond. So we have direct nonviolence, which is the social movements, civil resistance, protests, non-cooperation, nonviolent intervention, boycotts, sit-ins, marches, protests. We have structural nonviolence. This is building up, and Gandhi had you sort of, you resist the existing structures, but at the same time you begin building the structures of the world that we want to have. And then cultural nonviolence, encouraging these cultural themes that promote direct and structural nonviolence. And then, of course, sustainability, deep ecology, efficient use of resources, and so on. I have more slides, but I will stop there and turn it back over to Johnny, because I think from what I've seen of things Johnny has said and written about Dr. King is that there's such a synergy there, and we can see the sort of this sort of powerful force that was unleashed by Gandhi and the Indian freedom movement that inspires Dr. King and the civil rights. If we had another hour or two, I'd show you the path as I see it from Gandhi's ashram straight to the civil rights movement and beyond. Johnny?
Lester, thanks so much. It's good to see that diamond again after so many years. But Lester, making nonviolence relevant in this century, at this time, for this generation, is really, I think, part of, and perhaps principally, what the Turning Point Summit is really all about. And what you've presented is really this progression of understanding, where Gandhi, as you so eloquently demonstrated, took these two ideas, these counterposing ideas of violence and pacifism, if you will, that is direct physical violence and pacifism, and he brings them together and creates, as Galtung would say, a new idea that the world had not previously understood quite the way he was able to bring them together. And again, as was noted earlier, Gandhi did this at a very young age, still in his 20s, as he begins to think this through. Along comes Martin Luther King, decades later, actually, who learns about Gandhi as African Americans are struggling for their rights, particularly civil rights. But that emerges, as you know, into human rights. Significantly, again, though, still in his very young 20s, well, perhaps in his mid-20s, King begins to grapple with the idea of how to make nonviolent social change that is durable and sustainable over time. So while these young men wrestled with issues of change, and they did it through specific, direct, as we understand it today, action techniques, they were looking beyond the moment. They were looking beyond the event itself. And it seems to me that that's the work that I saw in the slide that you presented with the triangle, that as humans evolve and move through this civilizing process, as I like to call it, as they move through, I think that's Norbert Elias, right? As they move into now, as we move into the 21st century, is there more to nonviolence that we have not yet uncovered? And I think, as we saw with King, as I've noted, who pushes the envelope in his understanding of nonviolence, and he calls for a revolution of values, for example. So King takes nonviolence. He understands that Gandhi has built his framework of nonviolence on love and soul force and satyagrahi. And King then says that there's still more. There is this idea of infusing within the social structure a framework of values, so that the structure itself, how we organize society itself, reflects this framework of values. And that then becomes our challenge today, and the work still left undone, even after Gandhi and after King. and after you and me, Lester. So the challenge that we have today is to see what young women and men are going to do with this idea of nonviolence. And you teach that, don't you, Les, in some of the workshops that you're doing around the world?
Yeah, I really I like the way you put it. That in fact, both Gandhi and King had this kind of multidimensional way of thinking about nonviolence, and that sometimes gets lost. I think part of what happens with the mass movements, the demonstrations in the streets, bringing down a dictator, all of that is sexy, right, and exciting, and so on. But we also see the need to do this sort of multiple work, which I think Dr. King's idea of the world house, of building the house. At the same time, we're resisting this sort of dual. I don't know how to we're resisting and building. Yes. At the same time, that sort of dual process, which is very complicated. And I think we see it, for example, in Egypt. They brought down the dictator, but the people who were resisting had no structure to replace the dictatorship. And so, in Egypt, for example, we had we had the Muslim Brotherhood and the military were the other two nationwide organized institutional structures that ended up in sequence taking over the system after nonviolent resistance brought down the dictator. So I think part of our work and the work of this next generation is figuring out how to do that simultaneous work of beginning to institutionalize the values, as you put it, at the same time that they're resisting the structures that undermine those values.
I'm just going to interrupt. Speaking of the next generation, we have a great question from Edward. Did you want to ask your question?
I didn't want to interrupt because it's so interesting listening to the conversation. But it's just I've been trying to hear and channel and think of what is the best ways of channeling some of the learnings from King and Gandhi in the unique challenges that we're facing today. So the two questions in a sense might be the same, but what would be the biggest challenge for both King and Gandhi? Were they working for nonviolence in today's world compared to the unique context that they had? And I just wanted to add a second, actually, was what would be the actions that could best channel their teachings in our day-to-day lives today?
Really good question, Edward. Lester, do you want to go first?
Well, let me just say, I mean, what you're doing here is part of what needs to be done, right? We start with the actions. I'm not sure that the situation is that different from Gandhi's and King's. I mean, basically, I think the main difference is, well, there may be a couple of differences between their times and ours. Is, first of all, power has become even more concentrated. Gandhi was fighting against the British Empire, which sun never set, and King was fighting against the sort of racism of the American system, especially, although he saw a much bigger picture. And now we have a global system that's where power is increasingly concentrated. And so we have, there was a recent study by some Swiss scholars who saw 737 corporations accumulate control over all 80% of the world's transnational corporations and their value. I mean, there's this incredible concentration of power taking place in the world today. So we can't just resist that, although we've also seen the incredible ability of people power to bring about major change. But but we also need to begin building the networks. And what you're doing here, this is the structure that you're building, the structures here. And so that's part of why I'm so excited to meet you folks and to applaud what you're doing.
I would add, Edward, to Lester's important point that, particularly King, toward the end of his life, and remember now, King certainly understood that his life was daily in jeopardy. By the time he's in his early 30s, he recognizes that he had put his life on the line for the sake of the movement. But he understood that this resistance aspect of nonviolence, while incredibly effective, as Dr. Carson intimated in his opening comments, is not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And so this network that Lester Kurtz is speaking of is so crucial, and it's why this summit is so important. I think what Dr. King would look for today is where and how we're building that network. That is, Lester talked about people power, and people power is more than, as Lester indicated, resistance. There are other forms of nonviolent action. And in the triangle or the diamond that Lester showed in his slide, and the triangle that Johan Galtung talks about, by the way, I'll be doing a workshop, as Keshav indicated. I think it's Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. Tuesday and Wednesday, I see Keshav saying yes. I'll be doing a workshop on this idea of other forms of nonviolence, and how to build this network and utilize nonviolence not only as direct action, but as cultural action and as social cultural structural action. And then in Lester's framework, he even talks about environmental nonviolence. So there's so much more to explore. So the direct answer to your question is, I believe that King would be in line with these ideas of exploring and infusing the values of nonviolence in these frameworks of direct, structural, cultural, and yes, less ecological nonviolence as well. I hope that's helpful, Edward.
What we have that Gandhi and King did not is the internet, right? And so, although it's not the same as meeting in person, we all know that. And I wish we could all come together for a month and do this sort of intense community building. But there's some real possibilities, I think, now of using the internet, because we can all come together. But I'd like to say I found during the pandemic that we've solved the problem of space, but not of time. So there's still a time problem sometimes getting everybody globally together at the same time. But we do have these options of meeting one another this way and building that network, which in fact is precisely what the corporations and governments are doing, right? And militaries, they have the resources, the financial resources. We have the people resources, right? Because there are just a few thousand of them, and there are billions of us.
That's right, Les. In fact, I like to say, particularly in my workshops, that while the state may have the monopoly on violence, the people have the monopoly on nonviolence. And if Ackerman and Duvall are correct, and I think they are, nonviolence is a force more powerful than violence. And it's precisely because, as you indicate, Les, where there may be tens, hundreds, thousands of corporations, there are billions of people. And so the power really does reside in the people. What the people lack arguably, is the infrastructure, the organized, and someone else put in the chat, I didn't see exactly who, that the social fabric itself has been frayed. That is, the people have not organized and established a fabric that is comprehensive in putting in the infrastructures necessary to address the four arenas, if I can call them that now, the four segments, if I can call it that, of nonviolence. And if we focus solely on one element and miss the others, then we can't tap into the true power that the people have. Once again, why this summit is so important.
Yeah. So Johnny, can I play a little bit of that rap song?
Oh, by all means.
I won't play the whole thing, but I think people might enjoy it.
As long as you promise not to rap along with it.
Oh, okay. I'll work on that. I'll work on that.
This is Lumen,
Oh, sorry.
the first
sorry.
device for hacking your
I
metabolism.
had it set up
With
before
just one
without
breath,
the ad.
Lumen's
Okay, there we go.
Dedicated to all spiritual activists, truth seekers, and peaceful warriors worldwide. I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace. Once upon a time, not long ago, there was a boy who would grow and become a brave soul. He lived in India, and his name was Gandhi. He believed in human rights, and he fought for equality. He felt so strongly that he trained himself, because he realized first he'd have to change himself. He changed his clothes and decided to walk. Some days he practiced silence and refused to talk. When he was young, he studied to be a lawyer. Then he became a great spiritual warrior. He read from the scriptures of every religion and came to the realization that we're all God's children. Because he understood that we're all equal, he became a spokesman for the people. A karma yogi devoted to service, to spread truth and peace was his part. You gotta be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Just like Gandhi. Gandhi dedicated his life to the cause, even when it meant breaking unjust laws. He often faced prison and incarceration, but that only strengthened his determination. He said he would make every sacrifice, but that he would never kill or take a life. He used his heart instead of his fist, and he taught nonviolence as the way to resist. A peaceful soldier who used his mind to fight for the rights of humankind, but not just people, animals too. And his basic teaching, God is truth. He joined Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, Jains, and Jews. All the many paths that lead into the light that shines bright inside of me and you. You gotta be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Be the change that you wanna see in the world, just like Gandhi. Time makes the whole world run, and it takes more strength and faith to be kind. With that in mind, Gandhi took a stand.
We are out of time, Dr. Kurtz. I'm going to have to stop you. Could you put that link in the chat?
Yeah, I'll put that link there. Yes.
Please do.